Good evening. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Dan Torello. I work with the chair programs at the Kluge Center, and we're thrilled you're here for this event. This program is sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Carnegie supports the Library of Congress chairs in US-Russia and US-China relations. These are chairs that lead policy-relevant research and programs on U.S. relations with those two countries. This evening, I also want to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for partnering with us on this event. Andrew Weiss is both moderating and speaking this evening. This year, he is the Library of Congress Chair in U.S.-Russia Relations. He is also the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he oversees research on Russia and Eurasia. Prior to joining Carnegie, he was director of the RAND Corporation's Center for Russia and Eurasia. He also served as director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian affairs on the National Security Council staff, as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, and as policy assistant in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the administrations of Presidents Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. I want to thank Andrew for assembling this evening's panel. Seated on Andrew's right is Caitlin Welsh. She is director of the Global Food Security Program at CSIS. She brings over a decade of U.S. government experience to this role. Previously, she served on the National Security Council and the National Economic Council as Director of Global Economic Engagement, where she coordinated U.S. policy in the G7 and the G20. Prior to the White House, she spent over 7 years in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security. Thank you, Caitlin, for being with us. And on Caitlin's right is John Elkind. John is a fellow and senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. From 2009 to 2017, he worked on international energy and climate issues at the U.S. Department of Energy, helping to coordinate energy policy in the Obama administration and leading climate and energy programs with global partners. He departed DOE as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. As is our custom this evening, we will be recording the actual conversation, the panel conversation, but once we move to Q&A and to your questions, we will cut the recording and we will be completely off the record. So thanks again, and Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for joining us tonight. It's really nice to see so many people in person and to do these kinds of events in person. It really is meaningful. I've greatly enjoyed the opportunity to do an event here a couple months ago with Dan Torello, and I very much hope that we'll have plenty of time to have questions and to really engage in a detailed back and forth. Before we do that, I'll set the scene with some questions and comments for John and Caitlin to kind of get our heads around the policy dilemmas that are facing leaders, including President Biden, but that are truly global in nature and that are going to affect everyone in this room and people all around the world. So let me start with John, and let's talk about how we got to where we are right now. We are at day 140 and change of a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a war that, if you had to kind of think of what would have been the worst case outcome other than sort of overnight Russian military success in decapitating and destroying Ukraine's government, we're now kind of in a war of attrition, which presumably will last a really long time. At least that's my bold prediction, that this is not going to be over anytime soon. And that is going to have a series of impacts on the world economy, given not least because Russia is, on any given day of the week, one of the world's top 2 or 3 energy producing countries. And the world is now scrambling to think about how we wean ourselves off of Russian hydrocarbons. And so let's do it in 2 parts. I remember being a young analyst and getting schooled by John Elkind on the difference between the way Russia matters in global energy balances in terms of oil and in terms of gas. But the immediate crisis that I know preoccupies a lot of Americans is gas prices here. But before we come to that, let's talk about the role Russia's gas production plays, because in some ways I feel like we're headed into a very acute phase of this crisis based on what is happening literally this week, where Russia is slowly but surely finding ways to say to countries that it believes are causing pain to Russia that, you know, we used to be a very reliable supplier of gas that you use for your economies and to heat homes and provide for your prosperity, but now maybe that's not so important to Russia anymore. So can we talk a little bit about how that squeeze is being implemented by the Russian government and what it means for the knock-on effects both on the European economies as well as ours?
Good. First of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to actually see so many people in the flesh. As Andrew said, we've all done a million Zoom or other platform interactions over the last couple of years, and boy, this beats the heck out of that. And that's the high point for the night. I'm not entirely joking about that, because the picture that I think we are likely to spend the next while talking about is not one that is filled to overflowing with great, uplifting, encouraging news, right? This is a really serious time in the life of this country, in the life of our allies and partners around the globe, and in the life of, people in all walks of life and in all places around the globe. Already in advance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy markets were in a tight and challenged position. Why was this so? Because in the year preceding, you had both a very favorable rebound from the depths of the economic hit that were felt by the macroeconomy on a global level as a result of the pandemic. And on top of that, you had a series of other energy-specific things that had occurred, from a very severe winter of 2020 into 2021, severe southern hemisphere winters as well that called for additional supplies of natural gas to a degree that is unusual in many of the last, say, 20 years. You had other idiosyncratic things that happened, like a long period of summer doldrums in the offshore wind in Europe. So lots of scene setting that was challenging. Big growth, demand recovery, and some supply shocks on top of that. Russia's role, particularly in relation to Europe, has been a defining element of the energy supply picture in Europe for about the last decade. It's been the subject of decades and decades of challenge and, at times, really pronounced disagreement between the US government and governments in Europe. This has been a topic that we've been talking about with them for a really long time. But as a consequence of Europe's own sinking production of natural gas, and growing demand for natural gas in Europe, the supply relationship with Russia creeped from being around 20% in the 1990s to being north of 40% in 2021. So a really very considerable degree of reliance. Now, Russia's not the only supplier into Europe, and we can talk more about that later. The opportunities for supply with liquefied natural gas from the US, from Qatar, from elsewhere around the globe, but a big part of the story. Moreover, Russia's also about a quarter to a third of Europe's oil and refined product, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, et cetera, supply as well. So a really big player in the European market. And that's before we get to the effort that unfolded starting on the 24th of February to respond to Russia's actions in part through energy policymaking.
So now let's do that for, I know it's going to be a little confusing to keep track of it, but let's do that for food, because the numbers are not that dissimilar, where you have two massive sources of food production in Russia and Ukraine. So let's just start at the baseline, Caitlin, of how big the contribution was on February 23rd, before the war started, and where that food normally went.
Sure, great, thank you. Thanks for that question, and I think we're on the same page because I was thinking there are a lot of similarities between the scene that Jonathan set and what I can do when it comes to food security. I'll start actually with the state of global food security prior to this, prior to the war breaking out. Global food insecurity in leading up to the war because of what we call the 3 Cs, climate change, COVID, and conflict, was estimated to reach at least a 15-year high. That's global food insecurity, leading up to the war. And so that was the, generally speaking, the state of food insecurity was not a positive picture. Russia and Ukraine are major producers of very important commodities, and the way that global commodity markets work is that they're exporters. The countries that import Russia and Ukraine supplies are those that are in the general geographic vicinity of those countries. So generally speaking, it's countries in Asia, the Middle East, and in Africa that rely on the Black Sea for their imports. Generally speaking, the main products from the Black Sea: wheat, maize, oilseeds, so sunflower oil. Across net food importing countries, there are 50 countries that relied on Russia and Ukraine for at least 30% of their imports of wheat, and 26 countries that relied on Russia and Ukraine for at least 50% of their wheat. So they supplied a very important amount of essential commodities for net food importing countries. And to speak about Russia's role in this in particular, Russia was a net food importer at the turn of this century, and when Vladimir Putin came into office, recognized that this was a liability for the country, so deliberately invested in increasing Russia's agricultural productivity to the point that they became a net wheat exporter, and the top exporter of wheat since 2017. So they've been the world's top exporter of wheat since that time. Last year, they exported about 40 million metric tons of wheat, and USDA is estimating that this year they will also export 40 million metric tons, which keeps them at the top, as the top global exporter of wheat, again, tying world records ever set. So Russia is incredibly important in this picture. And when you take production offline from Ukraine and limit access to Russia's products indirectly through the effects of sanctions, that has further negative effects on food security for net food importing countries, again, starting from a point where food security was already quite bad before the war.
Okay, so now let's toggle back to global crude for a second, which you sort of touched on briefly, John. But the scale of Russia's impact on global crude balances is also non-trivial. So can you just quickly define for people, so we have the same baseline, how important a producer of crude oil for global markets Russia is?
Thank you.
Pre-war.
Right. So the global consumption of crude oil is roughly 100 million barrels a day. Round numbers, decent approximation. Russia was exporting on the order of 8.5 million barrels a day to global markets. Some of that is crude, some of it is refined product. So Russia's significance on global oil markets is huge. And its oil is going substantially to Europe. It's the largest export destination, but also to East Asia, to countries that are our treaty allies, Korea and Japan, as well as other countries around the globe. China has been a big purchaser historically. Certainly both China and India have increased their purchases in the time since the outbreak of war.
So now that's all what we would call left of boom. That's all like what the world looked like on February 23rd. And then the world shifted almost in an unrecognizable way based on the scale of this war. The humanitarian crisis, we now have upwards of 10 million or 11 million Ukrainians pushed out of their homes. We've had untold numbers of people killed. We have basically a Russia which has been pushed out, rightfully so, out of the global economy led by the US and Europe and Japan, where we have undertaken a series of economic sanctions, financial sanctions to basically tell the Russians that we will no longer have a normal relationship with you. And at the same time that that policy was implemented, largely by the G7 countries, the US plus EU plus Japan, there was a big carve out at the day the war began. And if I'm not mistaken, from every policy maker who matters in the world, they emphasized that they would create a carve out. And that carve out would focus on Russian oil and gas. And there would still be channels for countries to buy Russian oil and gas. And there was a good, sound reasoning behind that. And that was precisely because if you were to make it impossible for countries to access those commodities, it would have had a clear impact on prices that consumers pay, and it would have had an immediate impact on our economy's vitality and prosperity. So that didn't last for that long. And I think the war started on February 24th. By the second week of March, things changed really dramatically. And it became clear that something had to be done to basically challenge Russia's ability to, on the one hand, conduct a war in Ukraine, and on the other hand, get paid handsomely as prices responded to the worry in the market that Russian supply might get interrupted. Can you walk us through a little bit of the kind of sanctions that had direct impact on flows of Russian oil and gas at that early stage? Because the world now looks even different. We've gone through several phases of this, but just help people understand why we made that turn.
Right. So look, in the world of economic sanctions, one is always dealing with instruments that, let's be frank, have a degree of bluntness to them, right? This is not a scalpel operation. And there are lots of opportunities for unintended consequences. Economic sanctions may still be far superior to a situation where one is in a kinetic military confrontation with the Russian Federation. But we should look with a sense of realism at the degree to which one can very precisely target impacts and have the desired impact just when you want it. So initially, the goal was make sure that the impact from sanctions is greater on them than on us, the us being the United States, Europe, et cetera. And for a while, it looked like that was actually working pretty well. There is often, in a case where new sanctions are instituted, a tendency for market actors to overcomply. That is, until they really understand where the contours are, where the limitations are on what is permissible and what's not permissible, companies will say, I'm actually not going to touch that trade because it's too dangerous. But exactly as you say, Andrew, there was a choice made early on that the first tools to be reached for would not be sanctions against the oil or gas economies of Russia. But the trade flows were a kind of an assaulting reality. And so there was increasingly a clamor for sanctions that would target the energy sector. And this particularly came to the fore as the world learned about the brutality that had been visited on Bucha, the suburb just northwest of Kyiv, where it is clear people were shot while handcuffed and not able to defend themselves, back of the head material, and buried in mass graves. It came after the bombing of the train station in Kramatorsk, farther east, where families were seeking to get on trains and evacuate the war-ravaged regions. So the clamor that arose was a very serious thing. So okay, then what do you do? For the United States, the answer was easy enough, which was to say that there would be no importation of oil or refined product into the United States from Russia. But let's be candid, there was not much coming in any event. For Europe, that question was harder. And as the now 6 and perhaps coming soon 7 rounds of sanctions unfolded, and the discussion about what they would cover emerged into public discourse, what happened was something that's not really desirable, which is a big exercise of telegraphing where Europe might go. And that has led to some problems that maybe we can come to later in the discussion.
Okay. Similarly, in the weeks after the war began, I don't think food security was the central topic of policymakers' response. It was rightfully helping Ukraine have military equipment to defend itself, dealing with humanitarian challenges, imposing these punishing economic sanctions on Russia. And it only became clearer later, if I'm not mistaken, in March, that the world had a problem on its hands, and that as the harvest was coming in, there was no way to move it out of the Black Sea. So can you walk us through some of the predicate, though, because there was a deeper set of factors that put those flows at risk, some of which have to do with the overcompliance that John was talking about, as well as other structural factors in the food market.
Sure. Okay. Lots of issues there. I'll try to tease apart these different threads. So let's see. Talking about sanctions, Western sanctions very deliberately exempted all of Russia's agricultural products from the get-go. The only exception to the sanctions regime is that sanctions did deliberately target Belarus's fertilizer sector, its potash sector, actually. There were some lighter sanctions put on Belarus's fertilizer sector at the end of 2021. The US and the EU strengthened those when the war started. For reasons having to do with the importance of the Russian agriculture sector to global food security, again, the United States and other allies have always exempted their agriculture sector and continue to communicate that they will continue to do this, which is, I think, quite interesting in the context of Russia's own communication about the reasons for the global food security crisis that is upon us. They continue to blame this directly on Western sanctions, which again I think is ironic because we're exempting its agriculture sector. Main reasons for increase in food prices that we're seeing right now, and just for some context on that, in February, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's food price index reached an all-time high. In March, it reached a second all-time high. April and May and June, prices started to level off, but in certain subsectors, they still remain incredibly high. So for example, in the June food price index, the global price of meat reached a historic high ever. And while cereal prices are starting to level off, they're still almost 50% of what they were this time last year. So prices are starting to level, but they're incredibly higher than they were a year ago. You mentioned Ukraine's harvests. There's a couple different phases we can think about. Ukraine's main crop is winter wheat, which is planted in the fall, harvested about this time. When we hear about the grain that's stuck in Ukraine's ports, that's grain from last year that was ready to be exported. And that's about 18 to 20 million metric tons that we're talking about. There's a harvest that's ongoing right now that's in question for all of the reasons we're seeing all over the news, direct attacks on Ukraine's farms, disruption of labor supply, et cetera. The third harvest, the third phase that I think about is a harvest that will be planted this coming fall for harvest in 2023. And what we're seeing out of USDA is estimates of about a 50% reduction in the amount of wheat that Ukraine is expected to export next year. So that's thinking about the phasing of Ukraine's agricultural productivity.
So now do fertilizer and do the interplay between John's world and your world.
Certainly.
So that people get the why this is not just limited to effects on Ukraine. This is a global set of challenges.
Well, I mean, it's global because of the food, because of prices of wheat and maize and oilseed. So that alone makes it a global crisis. One reason that this crisis is different from the last major global food price crisis, which happened in 2007, 2008, is because of the implication of fertilizer in this crisis. Because fertilizer prices are so high, that limits the ways that the United States and other countries can help net food importing countries respond right now. The response used to be one that was really focused on increasing agricultural productivity in low and middle income countries, but that's more difficult to do when fertilizer prices are much higher. Fertilizer prices were rising last year already. I believe that, let me think, the World Bank was estimating that they have increased at least 30% since the start of the war, but regardless, fertilizer prices are high across the board for all types of fertilizer. Belarus, again, is a major supplier of potash. Russia is a major supplier of cheap forms of most types of fertilizer. While that sector is exempted from sanctions, as I mentioned, from the phenomenon that Jonathan was explaining from overcompliance, what I think that we are experiencing is that some firms are wary to deal with Russia, maybe wary to deal with Russia in their food exports and fertilizer exports, just again for the sake of being overcautious.
And if I might, just to put out the connective tissue, a lot of the fertilizer that is produced and applied around the globe is fertilizer that is created using natural gas as the feedstock. So if you are in a situation where natural gas prices are elevated, you can end up in a situation where companies, and this literally happened in a couple of European fertilizer producers back in October, where they said it does not make sense for us to be in the market right now because the cost of natural gas exceeds that which we can hope, even in the most crazy world, to get for as payment for the fertilizer that we produce. So that was, again, I remind, the energy markets were already in a place of tightness long before the 24th of February.
And if you don't mind if I jump into just to tie energy prices to food prices a little bit more, not only is natural gas an input to nitrogenous fertilizers, and so as energy prices increase, fertilizer prices increase, but also the price of agricultural production on farm increases, the price of transporting food increases, the price of cooling food, et cetera. A number of reasons that the price of food is highly correlated to the price of energy. So all of this putting further upward pressure on food prices right now.
Okay, so now we've kind of explained the scale.
Have we depressed you yet?
Scale of these interconnected and highly dynamic crises. Let's talk about policy response going forward. And we'll do this quickly, and then hopefully we can open things up for back and forth and questions from folks here around the room. So as the crisis unfolded, John, one thing became really clear. The original theory of the case behind economic sanctions was that it would have spectacular effects on the Russian economy, and it would create societal pressure, it would create divisions inside the ruling circles of the country. It would cause the economy basically to freeze up, and financial system and other things wouldn't function properly. And there were certain elements of that in the first few days and weeks of the war. But it soon became the case that as energy prices moved higher and higher, that even if Russia was not selling as much, particularly of the either crude oil or refined products, not talking about natural gas, where the scale for an immediate profit wouldn't, I mean, there's not as much immediate profit to be had, but where the profit really is had is in oil and gas, and oil markets, which are more fungible. Russia was able to make a killing, and you can measure that by its monthly, basically, cash receipts for sales of crude oil and products on global markets. And so rightfully, Ukrainians and other countries around the world looked at this and said, this is really messed up. Something has to be done to avoid letting the Kremlin profit handsomely at a time when the world is in such a crisis and when Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. But the way you do that without jeopardizing our economy, and it's a world where all the things you could do would immediately affect everyone because they would push prices up and they would potentially trigger economic headwinds. This administration, any European government really is in a bind. So can you talk a little bit about that bind and the policy options that have been pondered to deal with this problem?
Sure. And look, a couple things. The oil and gas industry is an industry where you have to run to stand still. What do I mean by that? In order to sustain production levels just flat, you need to continuously invest in exploration and production in order to keep the pressure levels in the subsurface such that you can withdraw oil, natural gas, and other liquids from under the ground. So there is an ongoing challenge that the Russian Federation faces, having access to capital, which no longer includes capital from most, if not all, Western companies, because they decided that they did not want to be part of Russia's storyline in 2022. So there's a challenge that is looming out there that is going to get more and more difficult for Russia to respond to. Now, you're right, Andrew, that for anybody that had the hope that we would see immediate economic pain, and even worse, economic pain that in the minds of some people could lead to Mr. Putin no longer being allowed to stay in office, that, frankly, in my opinion, was an overreach. And I don't think there were people, I think, in this town, people who are experienced enough to know that had that expectation. I think there's been some popular discussion in the press as to whether that's where you could end up, kind of thing. But I don't think there was really an expectation that was in the cards. Now, nonetheless, Russia has been profiting very well from the uptick in prices. And why have prices been going up if there are parties that no longer wish to purchase Russia's crude? Well, because you can kind of do the math, X number of barrels with Y amount of incremental price can yield for Russia, as it has been doing, a better outcome than Russia was in before. So there's an irony in that. But the sanctions also are having a second level of impact in terms of the macroeconomy. The Central Bank of Russia has been forced time and again to intervene in Russia's macroeconomy, in part by dramatically raising interest rates in the economy in order to keep the economy kind of marginally afloat. So my bottom line point here is anybody that would have hoped for overnight change in Russian direction on the basis of the economic sanctions alone was deluding him or herself. I don't think that that's been what the expectation has been from the administration. But there is this very clear and uncomfortable reality, which is that Russia is not feeling a big hit just yet. Now, last point. There's an inevitable tension that arises from an effort that is fundamentally about trying to create headwinds to Russia's exports of oil and gas. And that is that will raise prices, and we should not be surprised by that. Show of hands. Now I'm going to date myself. How many people in this room know the term victory garden? Okay, right. Kudos to you who are younger than old people like me who do, right? So I bring up the idea of a victory garden because of the point that in World War II, there was this sense that there was a patriotic duty to do what you could in your own household economy, right? That sense of patriotic duty to reduce how much energy we use is something that has not even dawned on the vast majority of the American public. But it is what we are looking at if our treaty allies, as is the case today, are under attack. Okay, in this case it's economic attack, if I'm talking about the NATO allies in Europe. But make no mistake, this is not kidding around. This is a very, very serious situation, and it's going to get lots more serious before it's done. And we can talk about that happy thought at a later point.
All right, so I'm going to ask one last question of Caitlin, and then we'll open things up.
Sorry.
Policy response to manage and mitigate a crisis of this scale. You sat in the White House and know what the possible extent of G7 tools are, and know what they can and can't accomplish. Presumably, and I don't want to steal your thunder, there aren't going to be perfect tools to fix this crisis, even assuming if the war ended tomorrow and something went back to a semblance of the pre-conflict reality. Is that a fair estimation?
It is, and also because the crisis that we're experiencing right now is one for which we don't have precedent. We have precedent for sudden food price spikes, for sudden reductions in production and exports, but we don't have precedent for a food price crisis that's caused by a war of this magnitude. So what's interesting to me is the response that's being cobbled together, for lack of a better term, in the G7 and promoted there. I'm pleased on the one hand because I sense that response it's quite comprehensive in the sense that it addresses immediate needs through increased funding for humanitarian assistance. It addresses long-term needs through supporting low and middle income countries and their agricultural productivity. It acknowledges the impacts on the fertilizer market by increasing production of fertilizer where it can, encouraging precision use of fertilizer to make best use of the fertilizer that we do have, the financing aspect. So for the countries that aren't experiencing the worst of food insecurity crises right now, that don't need humanitarian assistance, but that are net food importers, countries like Egypt, for example, many countries across North Africa, in the Middle East, East Africa, et cetera, rely heavily on on wheat imports in particular. So there are financing options to help net food importers like that. And also they're tacking on, of course, political statements and let me think, agreements to continue to oppose Russia in a number of ways. So I'm pleased that the response is rather comprehensive. I haven't seen the amount of funding attached to it that I would have expected. The last time a major food price increase happened, again, it was in 2007 and 2008. In response to that, the G8 at the time, because Russia was at the table, pledged over $22 billion in support of global food security. At this year's G7 summit, the G7 pledged an additional, I believe, $4 billion for a total of $12 billion this year. I'll give them some credit, knowing that the crisis is dynamic, it's changing, and so the response is probably evolving. Still, I'm hoping for more funding and continued high-level political attention to this.